I'm your host, Tess Brigham. And so let's start making sense of the mess together. So today I want to talk about this new experiment. So in January of this year, 2026, something really interesting happened in two very different American cities. One is San Francisco, California, and the other one is Abilene, Texas. They were linked through this social experiment called the party line. And I got very interested in this because, I live out here in the San Francisco Bay Area. This conversation around how do we connect people, of course, is very interesting and important to me. So I want to talk a little bit about what this experiment is and why I think it's so critical and how it relates to the workplace and to generations and all that good stuff. So it's truly a social experiment, right? This wasn't an online campaign. This wasn't a social media movement, right? This experiment are two physical vintage style payphones. So if you're young, you probably are like, oh, this is an antique. These old school payphones that we all, if you're older like me, you grew up with, they were installed in public spaces designed to connect strangers from opposite ends of the political spectrum, right? So the project was created by this tech startup called Matter Neuroscience, and the concept is very simple. In San Francisco, they installed a bright red payphone outside Black Serum Tattoo on Valencia Street in the Mission District, and the phone is labeled Call a Republican. And then in Abilene, Texas, they installed a bright blue payphone in front of 7-in-1 Books downtown, and that one is labeled Call a Democrat. And so here's how it works, right? When someone picks up the receiver in one city, the phone in the other city automatically rings. If the person on the other side picks up, the two strangers are instantly connected. No app, no usernames, no profiles, no bios, no algorithm deciding, who you should talk to, just humans on the other line. So the project was really intended to run for about 30 days. So with the possibility of expanding it to other cities if it works. And works, when I say works, their intention isn't about converting someone politically. The goal and the stated goal that they have is to reduce polarization and increase happiness through direct conversation by focusing on shared humanity rather than political conflict. So, and Matter Neuroscience, right? There's a neuroscience angle to this too, right? Their belief is that positive, non-hateful interactions can activate happiness boosting neurotransmitters like dopamine and lower cortisol, or that's our stress hormone. And honestly, it makes sense, right? Constant conflict keeps our bodies in a heightened sense of trauma response. So even when we think we're right, our nervous system still pays for it. So what's fascinating about all this is the conversations that people are having on the phones, right? Because they're not always political. Sometimes they are, but a lot of times they're not. Participants have reportedly talked about sourdough baking, local weather, their families, their jobs. I mean, politics does come up, but often it's just two people talking about their lives. And that to me is the most powerful part, because it's hard to demonize someone once there's a human voice instead of an internet stereotype. People ask me all the time, like, how can you do the work that you do? You're just listening to people talk about their problems. And that's not what it is. I have the opportunity to get to know someone. And when you get to know someone on a very human level, whether you like that person or not, whether you think you would be friends with this person outside of this or not, any of those things, whether you agree with them politically or not, the reality is that once you better understand someone and why they're doing what they're doing, their humanity breaks through, and it makes it so much easier to see them and see them in a different way. So, right, because this is the thing is that this is what it's like I said, it's hard to demonize someone, once you've heard their voice, instead of these internet stereotypes that we've been living with. And so I want to talk about why this matters, because this experiment isn't, it seems a little quirky, but in many ways, I believe it's this commentary about what we've lost culturally. We have lost the ability to tolerate discomfort. We've lost the ability to talk to people who aren't like us. We've lost the willingness to stay in conversations that really challenge us. And I don't think that at this point we fully understand how this algorithm driven living that we're doing with social media, what it's truly doing to us, right? We now understand a bit more about how phones affect us now, but this has been 18 years later. So it might take a couple decades for us to really understand how this algorithm affects us. But what we're seeing more and more is it keeps us siloed, right? Because when we are constantly being fed more of what we agree with, more of what we already like, more of the outrage content that triggers us in very predictable ways, the problem isn't having your, beliefs or values. The problem becomes when we're constantly reinforced by the same storyline, the same emotional storyline. We start to believe our viewpoint is the only one. I mean, disagreement doesn't just feel like disagreement, right? It starts to feel like danger. And that's the psychological trap. It doesn't just shape opinions, it shapes our identity. Our beliefs shape our identity. So beliefs become who I am, not just what I think. And once beliefs become identity, conversations will start to feel like a threat. So what do we do when that happens? Instead of conversations, we default to performance, right? Or we'll default to judgment or to labeling or reducing people into one-dimensional villains. And that outrage, it feels really powerful and it feels righteous and good. And, that's the thing is that discomfort, nuance are a lot harder, and especially in a world where everyone is stressed out all the time. So what the party line is forcing people to do who pick up that phone is to slow down. It forces people out of the speed and the cruelty of social media. There's no audience, there's no likes or comments, there's no reward for humiliating someone, or there's no reward for validating someone. It's just you and another person and the conversation. And here's the most important psychological takeaway. Connection requires discomfort. It always has. If you want a healthy society, a healthy workplace, a healthy family system, you have to accept discomfort as part of the deal. So this is very, very important. This does not mean that you're going to tolerate abuse or hate. None of that. It means learning to stay present with people who see the world differently than you. It's about willing to be awkward, willing to be misunderstood, willing to stay regulated long enough to actually hear this other human being talk about their feelings, right? And it also is about remembering that people can change. People change their minds all the time. Being bullied and yelled at never helps that. Shaming never helps. But the thing is that the shaming and the bullying and the humiliation that we tend to do when people are, changing their minds or disagreeing with us or going into right, over time, what happens is it hardens people. It makes people defensive and it makes them dig in either deeper because no one wants to admit they're wrong, or they dig in deeper and they just shut down. So, and all of this is true politically, but it's also very true in workplaces. So I want to talk about workplace culture, because I actually think the party line is a good metaphor for what workplaces need right now. If you want a positive and healthy work culture, it's going to require everybody to get a little uncomfortable. Discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. And it's often a sign that something very real is happening. So a lot of organizations will say they want psychological safety. They want feedback culture. They want collaboration. But then someone says something, too direct or awkward or perfectly polished or, and then the whole system panics. And then people gossip about it and people label and then they avoid and then they stop trusting each other and we're walking on eggshells. And suddenly in workplaces, communication becomes very high stakes. And this is where the generational dynamics come in, because each generation has a very different relationship to discomfort. So, boomers were taught to tolerate discomfort by pushing through, work hard, don't complain, deal with it. So the downside of that is many struggled with emotional vulnerability and naming needs that they had because they were trained to minimize them. And this is one of the biggest issues today is many boomers feel like the younger generations don't know how to tolerate discomfort And again, they just don't tolerate discomfort the way boomers tolerated discomfort. That's the difference. So Gen X, my generation, right? The typical Gen Xers, we learned that discomfort is inevitable and you should just handle it yourself. We're practical, we're resilient, but we can be a little judgy, very judgy, and interpret someone's, emotional conversations as like, unnecessary, dramatic, or like, oh my God, just get over it, move on. So millennials, they grew up with this achievement culture, right? And the promise that hard work equals reward. So many tolerate discomfort through over functioning, people pleasing. They say yes too much. They hold all the emotional labor, and then they burn out quietly. Gen Z grew up with a lot of instability and constant information overload, right? So they're in this place of they're not just trying to push through discomfort in the same way. They want boundaries and transparency and emotional intelligence and a clear why of what they're doing. And so the upside is they have strong mental health awareness. The downside is that for many of them, that they can interpret discomfort as harm or bad. And not all discomfort is harmful. In order to change, right, you have to feel some level of discomfort. And that's what happens all the time is people mistake that discomfort as being bad. And because, discomfort is not always trauma. Discomfort is not always someone violating a boundary. Sometimes discomfort is what happens when you're learning. It's what happens when you're hearing feedback that you may not like. It's, it's when our egos get bruised and hurt in some way, shape, or form. And, that's just the reality of how our nervous systems act and operate when we are being challenged on that level. And this is where I think the generational conflict part comes in, because it's not a moral failure, and I think a lot of times the generation can look at each other and see it as these moral failures, and you don't want to work and you don't care, all of these things. It's really about nervous systems that are mismatched. It's about different definitions of respect, different assumptions about what safety means. So how do we bridge all of this? What do? We do the most uncomfortable thing, right? We start and stay in the conversation. We talk about and we talk to each other without trying to win. We ask questions that we already know, that we don't know the answer to. Getting curious. People ask me all the time, what's the most important thing, a parent can do, a boss can, it's getting curious instead of reactive. Stop treating every misunderstanding as evidence that this person is out to get you or they're hurting you or they're wrong, right? It's about practicing repair, because real relationships are not the absence of conflict. Real relationships are the presence of repair and the willingness to listen and to change. And listening and being in conversation with someone also does not mean agreement. You can acknowledge and validate someone and listen and be respectful, but you can also disagree. And I think we've forgotten that. So to me, what the party line is quietly, this is what the party line's quietly teaching, that human connection is not built through perfect opinions. It's built through contact. It's built through our voices. It's recognizing the person behind the perspective that they have. And if this can happen between San Francisco and Abilene, Texas, it can happen between a Gen X manager and a Gen Z employee. It can happen between a millennial team lead and a boomer executive. It can happen in the conversations, your team has been avoiding. But again, it requires one thing, the willingness to be uncomfortable. So if you want workplace culture to improve, you have to normalize that level of discomfort. You have to teach people how to stay regulated in conversations, how to disagree without shaming, how to listen without spiraling, right? How to advocate for someone without attacking, and how to hold boundaries and still hold your relationships. So they always call this soft skills, but it's not soft work. This is advanced work. This is leadership work. This is what it is. So I'm going to end with this. I think years from now, we're going to look back and realize we lost something very vital in the age of algorithms. Not just, our attention span and, but the basic human muscle of talking to each other. So I genuinely love that someone put two payphones in the world and said, pick up the receiver, call the other side, not to fight, not to destroy, just to remember. To remember that the person on the other end of the line is human and that you are too. And maybe, just maybe, the discomfort is not the problem. Maybe the discomfort is the doorway. Thanks so much for tuning in with me today. And thanks for listening to the Gen Mess with Tess.